In 1992, a movie was released that would change Whitney Houston's life forever. The Bodyguard became a cultural phenomenon, grossing over $400 million worldwide and giving us one of the most iconic songs in music history. But what they never told you is that Whitney Houston almost didn't get the role. Not because she couldn't act, not because she wasn't right for the part, but because Hollywood executives looked at her skin color and said, "We need someone whiter." This is the story of how Kevin Costner fought an entire studio to cast Whitney Houston. The story of the racism she faced on set, the insecurities she battled, and the friendship that developed between two people the world said shouldn't be together. This is about how one movie broke barriers, shattered box office records, and gave Whitney Houston the confidence to believe she was more than just a voice. If you want to know the real story behind The Bodyguard, the fights that happened behind closed doors, the moment Whitney recorded the greatest cover song of all time in a single take, hit that subscribe button now. Because what you're about to hear is the truth Hollywood tried to bury. 1990. The script nobody wanted. The Bodyguard wasn't written for Whitney Houston. It was written in 1975 for Diana Ross and Steve McQueen. But McQueen died, the project stalled, and the script sat in development hell for 15 years. By 1990, Kevin Costner had become one of Hollywood's biggest stars after Dances with Wolves, and he had the power to resurrect projects. He loved the Bodyguard script and decided to produce and star in it himself. But there was a problem. Every actress in Hollywood wanted the role of Rachel Marin, the pop superstar being stalked by an obsessed fan. Madonna wanted it. Sharon Stone lobbied for it. Even Olivia Newton-John expressed interest. These were established movie stars, proven box office draws, safe choices for a studio investing millions. And then Kevin Costner said something that shocked everyone in the room at Warner Brothers. "I want Whitney Houston." The studio executives looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Whitney Houston, the singer? She'd never acted in a movie before. She had no box office track record. And perhaps most importantly to them, though they'd never say it explicitly, she was black. And Kevin Costner was white. And in 1990, Hollywood was terrified of interracial romance on screen. One executive, whose name has never been publicly released, but whose memo was leaked years later, wrote, "Whitney Houston is too ethnic for mainstream audiences. We need someone America can relate to, someone safe. This is a $200 million gamble, and we can't afford to alienate our core demographic." Translation: she's too black, and we're afraid white audiences won't accept her as a romantic lead opposite Kevin Costner. Kevin Costner's ultimatum. Kevin Costner read that memo, and he was furious. He'd worked with Whitney's music for years, believed she had a natural screen presence, and knew that her voice alone would elevate the movie to something special. But more than that, he believed America was ready for an interracial romance on screen, even if Hollywood executives didn't. So Kevin gave Warner Brothers an ultimatum that would become Hollywood legend. "If Whitney Houston isn't Rachel Marin, I'm walking. Find another Bodyguard, find another producer, find another movie, because I'm not making this film without her." This wasn't a bluff. Kevin Costner had just won Best Picture and Best Director for Dances with Wolves. He could do any movie he wanted. Warner Brothers knew that without Kevin, The Bodyguard would go back into development hell. They needed him more than he needed them. The studio caved, but they made their displeasure known. They cut the budget. They refused to give Whitney top billing, despite her being the actual star of the film, and they made it clear that if the movie failed, it would be on Kevin's head for insisting on casting an inexperienced black woman. When Kevin called Whitney to offer her the role, she cried. Not just because it was her first movie, but because she knew what Kevin had done for her, how he'd fought for her when the entire industry said no. That phone call created a bond between them that would last until Whitney's death. First day, on set, terror and doubt. Whitney Houston showed up for her first day of filming in 1991 absolutely terrified. She'd sung for presidents and sold out arenas around the world, but standing on a movie set with cameras and crew and the weight of a $200 million production on her shoulders, she felt completely out of her depth. Mick Jackson, the film's director, later described Whitney's first take. She was stiff, nervous, overthinking every movement. This was a woman who commanded stages effortlessly, but put her in front of a film camera and she froze. I was worried. The studio was already skeptical about her, and if she couldn't relax, they'd have ammunition to say, "We told you so." Kevin Costner saw Whitney struggling and pulled her aside. What he said to her in that moment, Whitney would repeat in interviews for the rest of her life. "Whitney, you're trying to act. Don't act. Just be. You're already Rachel Marin. You've lived this character's life. You know what it's like to be famous, to be watched, to feel unsafe. Trust that. Trust yourself and let the camera see who you really are." Something clicked. Whitney stopped trying to be an actress and just started being herself. And suddenly, magic happened. The nervousness translated as vulnerability. The stiffness became dignity. Everything that made Whitney Houston compelling as a performer came through on camera. But the challenges were far from over. The kiss, Hollywood's fear of interracial romance. One of the most talked about aspects of The Bodyguard was the romance between Rachel Marin and Frank Farmer, Whitney's character and Kevin's character. It was passionate, believable, and for 1992, groundbreaking. Because despite being an interracial couple, the film never made their races an issue. They were just two people falling in love. But behind the scenes, the studio was panicking. Test audiences in conservative markets were responding negatively to the romantic scenes, particularly the kiss. Focus groups in the South showed viewers using racial slurs to describe Whitney and expressing disgust at seeing a black woman and white man kiss on screen. Warner Brothers wanted to reshoot the kiss scene, make it less passionate, maybe even cut it entirely and imply romance without showing it. Kevin Costner refused. He told the studio, "This is 1992, not 1952. If audiences can't handle an interracial kiss, that's their problem, not ours. We're not changing a frame." But here's what most people don't know. Whitney Houston was terrified of that kiss scene, not because of Kevin, but because of what it represented. She knew that as a black woman kissing a white man on screen, she'd face backlash from both white and black communities. Some white viewers would see her as taking one of America's beloved white leading men. Some black viewers would see her as another black woman choosing white men over black men. The night before filming the kiss scene, Whitney called her mother Sissy, crying. Sissy, who'd faced her own share of racism in the music industry, told Whitney, "Baby, you're making history." Let them talk. You do your job and do it beautifully. And she did. The kiss scene in The Bodyguard is tender, passionate, and completely natural. It became iconic not because of the races of the people involved, but because it was two talented actors creating a genuine moment of intimacy. And despite the studio's fears, audiences loved it. I Will Always Love You. The song almost cut from the film. Here's something that will shock you. I Will Always Love You almost wasn't in The Bodyguard. The song was written by Dolly Parton in 1973 as a goodbye to her business partner, Porter Wagner, when she left his show. It's a simple, heartfelt country song about parting ways with love and respect. When the filmmakers were choosing songs for the soundtrack, someone suggested Whitney cover Dolly's song for a key emotional moment in the film. The studio hated the idea. They wanted something contemporary, something pop, something that sounded like Whitney's previous hits. They argued that a country song, even reimagined, wouldn't connect with urban audiences or international markets. Kevin Costner disagreed. He believed the lyrics perfectly captured the film's emotional climax when Rachel realizes she has to let Frank go for both their safety and sanity. He pushed for I Will Always Love You to stay in the film. Whitney was nervous about the song. She'd heard Dolly's version, which is sweet and understated. How do you take that and make it yours without disrespecting the original? She worked with producer David Foster to completely reimagine the arrangement, turning it from a country ballad into a power ballad that would showcase her vocal range. Here's the part that became legend. Whitney recorded I Will Always Love You in essentially one take. David Foster later said, "We did a few vocal warm-ups, ran through it once for levels, and then I said, okay, let's do a take for real." And what you hear on the record, that's basically what she sang in that first full take. The ending, where she belts those final notes, I was watching through the glass with my mouth open. It was superhuman. When Kevin Costner heard the finished recording, he called Whitney immediately and said, "You just made the most important song of your career. This is going to change everything." He was right. On set, the friendship that surprised everyone. As filming continued, something unexpected happened. Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston became genuine friends. Not a Hollywood publicity friendship, but a real connection built on mutual respect and understanding. They couldn't have been more different. Kevin was a Montana farm boy who'd worked his way up through years of small roles. Whitney was Newark gospel royalty who'd become a global superstar by her 20s. But they bonded over the pressure of fame, the burden of expectations, and the shared experience of making a movie that everyone expected to fail. Kevin protected Whitney on set. When crew members were dismissive of her because she was just a singer, Kevin shut it down immediately. When paparazzi tried to sneak onto the set to photograph them together and manufacture a romance scandal, Kevin had them removed and threatened legal action. He wanted Whitney to feel safe, to focus on her performance without external noise. Whitney, in turn, opened up to Kevin in ways she rarely did with anyone. She told him about the pressure from Clive Davis to maintain a perfect image, about her struggles with feeling like she had to represent all black women in film, about her fears that she wasn't good enough. And Kevin would remind her again and again, "You are enough, more than enough. Just be yourself." There's a moment in the film, the scene where Rachel breaks down crying after a stalker gets too close, where Whitney's performance is heartbreakingly raw. That wasn't acting. That was Whitney releasing years of fear about her own safety, her own vulnerability in the spotlight. And Kevin, as frank comforting Rachel, wasn't acting either. He was being a friend, letting Whitney have that emotional release in a safe space. The racism she faced. But not everyone on set was as supportive as Kevin. Whitney faced subtle and not so subtle racism throughout filming. A lighting director complained that lighting Whitney's dark skin was difficult and suggested they use lighter makeup on her. A costume designer initially wanted to put Whitney in more urban clothing until Kevin intervened and insisted Rachel Marin would dress elegantly, not stereotypically. The most painful incident happened during a scene being filmed at a high-end restaurant. Some of the extras, wealthy people hired to fill the background, made comments loud enough for Whitney to hear about how unrealistic it was for someone like her to be in that environment. As if black women didn't belong in expensive restaurants. As if Whitney Houston, one of the biggest stars in the world, didn't have every right to be anywhere she wanted. Kevin overheard the comments and stopped filming immediately. He had those extras removed from the set and gave a speech to the entire crew about respect and professionalism. But the damage was done. Whitney went to her trailer and cried. She'd spent her career breaking barriers, proving herself over and over, and she was still facing the same racism her mother's generation had faced. That night, Kevin went to Whitney's trailer and found her considering quitting the film. "I don't know if I can do this," she told him. "I'm tired of proving I belong everywhere I go. I'm tired of being the first, the only, the exception." Kevin sat with her for 2 hours, not trying to convince her to stay, just listening. And then he said something Whitney never forgot. "The reason they're threatened by you is because you're changing the game. Every time you show up and excel, you make it harder for them to keep people who look like you out. That's power, Whitney. That's why they're scared." Whitney came back to set the next day, and she gave the performance of her life. The movie premieres, breaking records and barriers. The Bodyguard premiered on November 25th, 1992. The studio was cautiously optimistic. Early screenings had gone well, the soundtrack was getting radio play, but nobody predicted what would happen next. The movie opened at #1 and stayed there for weeks. It eventually grossed over $400 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing films of the year. But more importantly, it proved that audiences had no problem with a black female lead in a romantic thriller opposite a white male star. It broke the barrier Hollywood had been too afraid to test. The soundtrack became even bigger than the movie. I Will Always Love You stayed at #1 for 14 weeks, one of the longest runs in chart history. It sold over 20 million copies worldwide. It became Whitney's signature song, eclipsing even her earlier hits and it made Dolly Parton, who retained the songwriting royalties, over $10 million. Dolly later joked that she should send Whitney a thank you basket, but she really meant it. Whitney's version had turned a lovely country song into a global phenomenon. Critics who'd been skeptical of Whitney's casting had to eat their words. She was nominated for several awards for her performance and won widespread praise for her natural screen presence. Suddenly, every studio in Hollywood wanted Whitney Houston for their movies. She'd proven that singers could cross over to film, and more importantly, that black women could carry major Hollywood productions. At the movie's premiere, Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston walked the red carpet together. When reporters asked Kevin what it was like working with a first-time actress, he said, "Whitney isn't a first-time actress. She's a natural. She gave me one of the best performances I've ever worked with. This movie wouldn't exist without her." The Bodyguard 2, Why It Never Happened. Given The Bodyguard's massive success, a sequel seemed inevitable. Screenwriters were hired. Kevin Costner was interested. The studio desperately wanted it, and for a while, it looked like it would happen. The Bodyguard 2 was supposed to reunite Rachel and Frank years later, with Rachel facing a new threat and Frank coming out of retirement to protect her. The script was written, locations were scouted, and a production timeline was set for 1996. But it never happened, and the reason why is heartbreaking. By the mid-1990s, Whitney's personal life was unraveling. Her marriage to Bobby Brown was becoming increasingly chaotic. Her drug use, which had been manageable earlier, was spiraling. Her voice, while still powerful, was showing signs of strain, and the studio, which had been so desperate for a sequel, suddenly got cold feet. Internal memos from Warner Brothers, leaked years later, show executives expressing concern about Whitney's reliability and public image. They worried that her marriage to Bobby Brown, who had his own legal and personal issues, would affect the movie's marketability. They suggested recasting Rachel Marin with another actress or shelving the project entirely. Kevin Costner fought for Whitney again. He argued that her personal life was her business, that she was a professional who would show up and do the work. But by 1997, even Kevin had to admit that the timing wasn't right. Whitney needed to focus on her health and family, not the pressure of carrying a major motion picture. The Bodyguard 2 was officially canceled in 1999. Whitney was devastated. She'd wanted to prove that The Bodyguard wasn't a fluke, that she could have a sustained film career. But the combination of her personal struggles and the studio's unwillingness to support her through them meant that opportunity slipped away. In later interviews, Whitney would say that not doing The Bodyguard 2 was one of her biggest regrets, not just for her career, but because she wanted to work with Kevin again, to recapture that magic they'd created together. Kevin's final goodbye. When Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, Kevin Costner was one of the first people contacted. He was asked to speak at her funeral, and he initially declined. The grief was too raw, the loss too personal. But Whitney's family insisted. They said Whitney would have wanted Kevin there, would have wanted him to speak about their friendship, about what they'd created together. Kevin Costner's eulogy at Whitney Houston's funeral is one of the most moving speeches ever given. He spoke about meeting Whitney for the first time, about fighting for her to get the role, about watching her blossom into a confident actress. He talked about their friendship, about the woman behind the superstar image, about how much she meant to him. But the most powerful moment came when Kevin talked about that first phone call, when he'd offered Whitney the role and she'd cried. He said, "Whitney, I always told you that you were enough. But the truth is, you were more than enough. You were extraordinary, and I am honored that I got to know you, to work with you, to call you my friend." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. After Whitney's death, Kevin Costner gave only one interview about her. He was asked if he had any regrets about the Bodyguard or their friendship. He paused for a long time and then said, "My only regret is that Whitney never fully saw herself the way I saw her, the way the world saw her. She carried so much doubt, so much insecurity despite all her success. If I could go back and tell her one more time that she was enough, that she was extraordinary, I would..." The legacy. The Bodyguard remains one of the most successful romantic thrillers ever made. Its soundtrack is one of the best-selling soundtracks in history, and I Will Always Love You is still considered one of the greatest vocal performances ever recorded. But beyond the commercial success, The Bodyguard's real legacy is what it represented. A black woman as the romantic lead in a major Hollywood film, treated with dignity, respect, and genuine affection. It opened doors for other women of color in film. It proved that audiences would embrace diverse stories and diverse faces. Whitney Houston made only a handful of movies in her life. The Bodyguard, Waiting to Exhale, The Preacher's Wife, and Cinderella. But The Bodyguard stands above them all, not just because it was her first, but because it captured her at a moment of confidence and joy, before the pressures of fame and personal struggles overwhelmed her. When people remember Whitney Houston now, they remember the voice, the songs, the icon. But they also remember Rachel Marron, walking into that Miami club in a stunning dress, commanding every eye in the room. They remember her chemistry with Kevin Costner. They remember her belting "I Will Always Love You" while rain poured down around her. They remember that she wasn't just a singer, she was a movie star. And despite Hollywood's initial resistance, despite the racism she faced, despite the doubts and fears, Whitney Houston proved she belonged on that screen just as much as she belonged on any stage. What Hollywood tried to hide, the full story of The Bodyguard's production, including the racist studio memos and the extent of the resistance to Whitney's casting, only came out years later. Warner Brothers never publicly acknowledged how hard they fought against Kevin Costner's choice. They never admitted that they'd called Whitney too ethnic or worried about her being a black romantic lead. Instead, they took credit for her success. They marketed The Bodyguard as proof of their inclusive casting and progressive values. They conveniently forgot that they'd tried everything to prevent the movie from being made with Whitney Houston in the lead role. Kevin Costner never forgot. In interviews years later, he'd subtly referenced the fights he'd had, the resistance he'd faced. He never named names or went into explicit detail, but he made it clear. Whitney Houston earned her place in that film, and she overcame barriers that most people never knew existed. Final thoughts. The Bodyguard was supposed to be a simple romantic thriller, a commercial film designed to make money and entertain audiences, but it became something more, a statement about race representation and the power of believing in someone when the world says no. Kevin Costner believed in Whitney Houston when Hollywood didn't. He fought for her when it would have been easier to accept a safer choice. He supported her when she doubted herself, and together they created something magical. Whitney Houston's performance in The Bodyguard showed the world that she was more than just a voice. She was a presence, a talent, a force. And despite the racism, despite the doubts, despite the challenges, she proved everyone wrong. The movie is called The Bodyguard, but in many ways, Kevin Costner was Whitney's bodyguard during that production, protecting her from the industry's prejudices and her own insecurities. And Whitney, in turn, gave him and the world a performance that will never be forgotten. I Will Always Love You became Whitney's defining song, but it's also a perfect description of the friendship she shared with Kevin Costner, a friendship built on mutual respect, support, and understanding, a friendship that transcended the movie and lasted until her death. And now, 12 years after Whitney's passing, The Bodyguard remains a testament to what she was capable of when given the chance, when supported, when believed in. It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to fight prejudice isn't with words, but with excellence. Whitney Houston showed up, did the work, and proved them all wrong. Rest in peace, Rachel Marin. You were always enough. You were always extraordinary, and you will always be loved.